Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our webinar, How to Write a Public Comment. My name is Beth Yenis. I'm the Manager of Advocacy here at National PTA, and I am joined for this webinar by Lindsay Kabatsky, our Government Affairs Coordinator. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today to learn some tips and best practices for writing a public comment and to hear a bit more about some upcoming opportunities to write a public comment as well. So to provide a bit of context on why we are hosting a public comment webinar is public comments are a really great opportunity where a government agency or other body is asking you for your feedback directly. This is not something that you see a lot, but it is something that is a wonderful opportunity to get to share your opinion on a piece of policy or a piece of legislation that might impact you or your family. And so we wanted to give you some tips for this great opportunity to make your voice heard. It can be intimidating to write a public comment if you've never done it before, but with these best practices that we'll be sharing, we hope that you will find it reassuring that a public comment is just an opportunity to share your thoughts and the potential impact of a piece of policy on you and your life. So about half of the states have upcoming public comment periods, and that's related to the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. And so what we're going to do is we're going to spend a few minutes giving some background on ESSA, and we'll talk about why there is an upcoming public comment period, and then how to make sure that you're taking advantage of that. And then we'll dive into some specifics on writing the public comment itself. So with that, I'm going to send it over to my colleague, Lindsay, who's going to provide some information on ESSA. Lindsay?
Yeah. Thank you, Beth. So the Every Student Succeeds Act is the new federal education law that replaced No Child Left Behind. It's a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that was originally passed by the Johnson administration back in the 1960s. So this new iteration of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed in December of 2015. It provides greater flexibility to states and school districts to design educational plans and programs that best meet the needs for their students, teachers, and other educational support personnel. But with this greater flexibility becomes a bigger opportunity and responsibility for these states and districts. So these new school districts and state education plans are in the implementation phase right now, and the whole goal of the new law is to provide more supports for students and less punitive consequences for teachers and school districts with the new education requirements. So it's a less of a top-down prescriptive role from the federal government, and it's giving a lot of the responsibilities to states and local districts. ESSA also makes sure that the accountability systems provide the necessary supports and interventions and resources to students and schools based on their unique needs. So if we go to the next slide, National PTA's #1 goal during this implementation process of this new education law is to educate and empower parents and families to be active participants at the federal, state, and local levels. So for the first time, ESSA acknowledges that the critical role of parents is important for the students' success and school improvement efforts under the new law. They're required to be involved in the development of new education plans in addition to the overall implementation of the law. Parents and children, as you all know, are consumers of our nation's public education system, and parents are essential partners in their child's education. They haven't always been included at the decision-making table, which has caused confusion and mistrust and backlash when new education initiatives are implemented and considered. National PTA firmly believes that with local, state, and federal advocacy and input by parents and other advocates, that the new education law can be successful and students can have a greater and more impactful educational experience at the school level. So what are some of PTA's priorities during this implementation process? Parents care about all aspects of their child's education, from the school environment and safety, to their teachers and standards and curriculum, to their social and emotional development. And National PTA has identified several areas where parent feedback and voice is requested and required in the process under the new law. So priorities are centered around these areas that are statutorily required to be to where parents are required to be engaged or meaningfully consulted. So this includes family engagement policies at the local level, standards, what types of standards and assessments that the school and state and districts are going to have, what type of accountability systems that the schools and teachers are going to be held under, and then what are the local report cards, like your district report cards and your state report cards, what are they going to look like, what are they going to have inside them to make sure that we understand how our schools and students are doing, and then how are we improving schools and how are parents involved in improving the schools at the local level. So what are some of the opportunities during this process where PTA members can take action and they can have their voices heard? So each state plan will go through a peer review process. That includes where teams of teachers, parents, principals, and other school leaders, and some specialized instructional support personnel, and other state and local education agencies and community members and researchers will evaluate each state plan. So ESSA state plans are either due April 3rd or September 18th, and after those are reviewed by those teams, they will be sent back to the state if they don't meet some of the requirements under the law. So here, all of the blue states are states that have already submitted their state education plans. So these are states that did it on the April 3rd deadline, and so the Department of Education and the Secretary of Education are in the process of reviewing these state plans. The department has already reviewed and submitted back to states, three different states. So that's Nevada, New Mexico, and Delaware, and they requested that they provide a little more information on some of their state education plans to meet the requirements under the law. If your state is in yellow, then you're likely to still have a comment period. If you're in blue, as we said, you're already submitted and your comment period is over. But the skill of commenting can be utilized in other situations, specifically when the states start implementing the local education plans at the district level.
Great, so thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Lindsay. So this is a really good example of a time where you really should get to know your state. So as Lindsay mentioned, about a little bit more than half of the states are going to be releasing their draft state plans or have recently released a draft state plan for submission on September 18th. So what that means is that now is your chance to go take a look at your draft state plan. So you can find this by visiting your state education agency website. So that would be your state Department of Education or whatever it's called in your state. And you should take a chance to review your state's draft plan or look for a summary from a trusted source. We've seen the state plans for the states that were the April 3rd states, and they can be several hundred pages, and we know that most people don't really have time to do that. But what we also know is that some states like Michigan, for instance, put out a really good summary of the content of their draft plan, which parents and other education advocates can use as a resource to read a quicker description of specific areas of interest. We also know that many states have created a table of contents that will have a list of what content there is so that you can skim for what is most important to you and your priorities. So this way you don't have to read through the whole plan. You can just go to page 25 and see where they talk about the implementation of whatever it is that is important to you. And then you should look to see when your public comment period is open. So one thing that we do know is that not all of the states have websites that are up to date or have as much information as maybe we as consumers would like. But they do have to post it publicly for you to see. And so if you can't find this on their website, you should give your state education agency a call and try to find out when the public comment period is going to be. So what we'll do is Lindsay is actually going to share with you a little bit more about the specifics of when the public comment period has to be open under ESSA for the state draft plans for comment, and then we'll go back into a little bit more of the detail on public comments themselves. Lindsay?
Thanks, Beth. So here is the statutory requirement that was passed into law by Congress and the Obama administration when they passed the Every Student Succeeds Act back in 2015. So if we go to the next slide, it'll be a little bit more in layman's terms. So the comment period must be 30 days long after they publish the draft of the state education plan prior to submitting to the Department of Education. In addition, the state education agencies must consider comments before finalizing the state plan for submission in September. These also must be, the comment periods, advocates must have an easy access to submit comments. It must be easily understood on how that process works. And in addition, they must, by considering these comments, they show that they're being, they're talking to all different stakeholders when reviewing state education plans. So like we've seen in one state, New Jersey, they list all of their comments in the appendix, and then they refer those to specific sections in their state plan that they said they revised that section based on comments that they received. So we know that a lot of states are being very transparent and open about the comment period and how they are taking those comments into consideration when they're reviewing and drafting their state education plans prior to submitting to the Department of Education.
Great. So back to our question of the day is, what is a public comment? So a public comment is essentially the chance to make your voice heard and share your thoughts on what a government agency or body is doing. So this is usually a more formal type of statement that you are submitting. It's something that government employees or agency officials are going to be reviewing, and it's something that can become part of the record. As Lindsay mentioned, we saw public comments have been included in the appendices of several of the state plans that were already submitted. And so this is something that lives for longer than just calling and saying, I do or do not support this policy. This is something that the agency can hold on to. So let's get into some of the types of public comments. So an agenda comment is a comment that is related to a specific agenda item. An example of this would be if you're at a school board meeting and there's an agenda item to discuss a new proposal, and at the meeting, attendees are invited to step up to the microphone to share opinions on the proposal. This is probably something that many of you have seen if you've attended a school board meeting or another similar meeting. These are usually verbal comments, so these are not things that you have to come with prepared remarks written down, but these are an opportunity to share your opinion. They become part of the record of the meeting, and they're taken into consideration by whatever the body that's meeting is when they decide on next steps for that policy. Another type of public comment is a general public comment. So these are not items that are specifically on the agenda, but are under the jurisdiction of that body. So what does that mean? That means that sometimes there are public comments that you can submit that don't necessarily relate to a specific policy or to a specific piece of legislation, but it's a formal opportunity to share your thoughts on work that agency or body is doing more broadly. So if at your school board meeting you're talking about, there's an opportunity to share feedback, and you share feedback on a policy that is not currently under review or a different matter altogether, but is still something that school board has control over, that would be a general public comment. And then a policy draft comment is a comment that is made in relation to draft policy documents that have been released. And so if you are signed up for our National PTA Takes Action Center, which if you're not, you should sign up. If you get messages from us about policy comments, that's usually about a policy draft. And so a great example of this is showing the impact that public comments can have. The U.S. Department of Education had released a few months ago a new draft template for the states who are putting together their draft plans. So what we're talking about now, these state draft plans, and the new template that the Department of Education put out said that for the states submitting in September, they no longer have to include a description of how they engaged stakeholders, so parents, advocates, people like you, that they didn't need to describe how they engaged you in their state draft plan. And because this was a change in the policy, they opened up a public comment period. We sent out an action alert asking folks to send in public comments. And the next thing we knew, they had several hundred public comments right in their inbox that they then had to read, and we got feedback from the Department of Education about how effective it was that we had sent this out to folks to send in a public comment, because it was overwhelming to them, the number of public comments they got. And so there are a few takeaways here. One takeaway is that if only 500 or so public comments makes the United States Department of Education at the national level take notice, imagine how many fewer public comments it will take for your state's education agency to take notice when it comes to the draft state plans. And so with that, I will share that we have seen in several of those state plans. So Lindsay mentioned New Jersey, for instance, where they included every single public comment they received in an appendix. We saw that there were about 150 or so public comments submitted in to their state plan. And so, you know, 150 comments is really not that many if you and all of your unit members of your local PTA unit write a public comment on a specific issue, you can really, flood your state education agency with what they will now have to pay close attention to. And so with that, we'll start talking about actually writing a public comment. And so there are several formats that a public comment can take. So we mentioned written public comments and oral public comments. And we'll talk a little bit about electronic public comments because that's really just a form of submission. So when Lindsay was talking before about how it has to be easy for you, an electronic submission option has to be available for you to send in a public comment under the ESSA draft plan public comment requirement. And so that just means that you can send an email or use an online submission form, whatever your state education agency chooses to do. And this way you don't have to write out a letter and put it in the mail and put a stamp on it and send it to them. So there is no minimum or maximum length for an effective comment. Having looked at the ones that have been submitted that we saw, many of them are short, sweet, and to the point. We'll talk a bit about the content, but this is a great time to highlight that the content is really what matters. It's not about the length of the comment. So here are a few things to consider. Agencies often ask specific questions or raise issues on subjects where they're actively looking for more information. So this is not necessarily the case with the ESSA public comments, but this is a great reminder that public comments arise for a variety of circumstances. So even if your public comment period is closed right now for ESSA, you might have a time in the future where an agency is asking a question to learn more information or to find out what the community it would impact is most interested in and what's most important to you. And so you should certainly pay attention to what that agency is specifically looking for. If they say what is important to you under provision A and only A, maybe don't write about provision B and C, making sure that you're following guidelines that are set out by the agency. And then I also want to note that the comment process is not a vote. What do I mean by that? So one well-supported comment is often more influential than 1,000 form letters. So it's not just a tally. If an agency gets back 100 comments that just say, I support this regulation, signed your constituent, they're likely to overlook those in favor of comments that are specific and provide facts, personal stories, figures, and a description of the impact on the community. Now, I know that we just said that they have to consider all of the comments, but not all comments are created equally. And so if there's a very well-reasoned argument in a comment, that can be more impactful on the person who is reading the comment than seeing that 50 people sent in the same postcard saying, I do or do not support this comment. So what should you include in your public comment? Well, like we said, you should include specific issues or areas of concern or support. You should support your claims with reasoning, evidence, and how you will be impacted. You should or can address trade-offs and opposing views, so acknowledging that there could be two sides to this and saying why your side is the one that's the best choice. And then you should identify your experience that will distinguish your comments from others. So this is a great opportunity to make your voice heard, get your story out there, and tie it to a human. So a great example of this, especially in public education, is how would this impact your child or your family or your child's school or their potential to succeed in the future. You know, there are few things more compelling than a personal story, and if you can find a way to tie that to the policy, then you are ahead of the game, especially if you don't necessarily have any hard facts or figures. So if you can't say this policy will cost our school district X number of dollars, but you can quantify it by saying it will strip our students of the opportunity to participate in a fundamental program that will help them succeed in their future, then you know, it is a best practice is certainly to include a personal story or the narrative of the impact on your family or your community. So let's get into the structure of a public comment, and keep in mind, going back to the fact that these are just basic guidelines and that there's no length requirements, that these are just best practices. So some tips to make sure you have all the nuts and bolts in place, but certainly does not have to be a small novel of any length. So we have an opening, so make sure that you're addressing your comment to a specific person or group. Your first paragraph should specifically name the policy you're commenting on and what your recommendation is. So let's keep in mind that the person who's reading your comment is likely an employee of a government agency, whether at the local, state, or federal level. They probably have a lot of things that they're working on, and it may not be immediately clear what your position is. So if you put it right up front and say, I disagree with X, Y, and Z, or I support these two things that are in the draft plan, it will help make it clearer for them, so there's less potential confusion, and it will also help them feel like your comment is well formatted, which can sometimes save them time and effort from reading it. So your next paragraph should introduce yourself and provide evidence or your personal narrative in support of your position. This is a great opportunity to tie that policy into your story and why it's important to you. You can address the opposing view and any alternative ideas that you have that might be better than the policy proposal that you're commenting on. And then in closing, you should summarize, you should thank the policymaker, and ask for action. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through an example of a public comment. This comment is not related to education, so don't look for any meaning in it necessarily. It's about dog walking, but it's just a great example of how to hit on each of our points. So we have an opening, and we'll go through the format specifically to make sure everyone sees that we're hitting the most important parts here. But you can see the opening addresses your comment to a specific person or group. Our first paragraph, you see that the person specifically says, I do not agree with Proposal 174. And so they specifically have named the policy that they are commenting on and gave a recommendation. They then go on in paragraph 2 to introduce themselves, so as a responsible dog guardian, and then they provide a little bit more of their personal narrative that supports their opposition to the proposal. In the next paragraph, you see addressing opposing views and an alternative. So they talk about the long-term preservation of natural resources in the neighborhood. And then they suggest that if the city council provided better signage and had environmental barriers, then they wouldn't need this restrictive law on dog walking. They also point out in their next paragraph that there are some other places where this has worked. They have an ask, which is that they hope that the council will vote no on the proposal and come up with an alternative, and then they sign it with respectfully their name. So you can see here that they have very carefully followed each of the structural suggestions to create an effective comment. Now, like I said, this comment could certainly have been much shorter and have been equally as effective. If the comment was longer, you know, perhaps if they had more facts or anything like that, it would have been equally as effective as well. But I tend to say that a best practice is that there's diminishing returns in writing comments longer than what you would want to read, because probably the person who is reading it would not want to read something that is 12 pages long that could be 2. But overall, this would be an effective public comment because it follows the structural best practices to make sure that the person reading it knows why you are writing, understands your arguments, and is left with a clear understanding of what you are asking them to do. Great. So what we'll do now is we'll go through some next steps of how you can make sure to make your voice heard in the public comment process, specifically under ESSA. So you should be looking for your state's draft plan on your state's SEA website. Read the plan, or like we said, find a trusted summary or skim through the table of contents for what's most important to you. You can identify policy or issues to comment on. So at pta.org/ESSA, we have some great resources available that share PTA's priorities and some helpful guides for parents and education advocates to educate yourself a little bit on some of the issues that are most likely to come up. You should find out when your state's open comment period is and any rules or guidelines for submission. So just making sure that if the state says the public comment period is open for 30 days, that you're taking note of when that deadline is. If it says that you have to send it to a specific email address, making sure that you're noting that down. If it provides an online submission form that has a word limit, then making sure that you're taking a look at that as well. And then write the comment. That's the fun part. That's the part where you get to make sure that your voice is heard in the process and make sure that your state's education agency is taking notice of your views and what's important to you. And that can happen, like we said, for a variety of different policies, but right now is a great chance to jump in and get your feet wet if you have a state that's submitting on September 18th their draft plan to make sure that your voice is heard in the process this summer. So what we'll do now is we'll do a question and answer. Lindsay will read off any questions that come in and we can take a shot at answering them for you.
Thanks, Beth. So the first question we have is, what makes a comment less effective, or what is an ineffective comment that you've seen?
Sure. So an ineffective comment would be a comment that just says, I do or do not support this policy. It would be a comment that doesn't specifically speak to the issue or the impact on the community or on you individually. I would also say that a best practice is that your comment should be respectful, and it should likely not be partisan in nature in any way. So an ineffective comment would be a comment that says, this policy that you support is a terrible policy and is why I didn't vote for you anyway. So that would not be something that would be particularly effective. Much more effective would be pointing out why you disagree with a particular policy position and then providing some facts to back it up, tying it back to your community or to yourself as an individual or parent, and being polite and respectful, because the person who is reading it, if you want them to take it into consideration and view it favorably, you should be as polite and respectful as possible. Any other questions, Lindsay?
Yeah, so another question is, what are some of the advantages or disadvantages of form comments versus, original comments that somebody's written without the assistance of like a advocacy organization?
That's a great question. So the best practice here would be that a personalized individual comment is going to be most effective. However, I will say that if you do not have time to write a personalized individual comment, then it is better to send in a form comment than no comment at all. So your best practices here are to at least submit a comment and ideally take the time to write out a personal and thoughtful comment that specifically addresses those things that we've talked about including. Any other questions, Lindsay?
No, that looks about it.
Okay. So what we have for you now is we have our email addresses. If you have any additional questions after participating or viewing this webinar, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Lindsay. We are happy to answer any questions you may have. I will also urge you to check out our national PTA digital and social media platforms. So as I mentioned, on our PTA website, pta.org/ESSA, we have a lot of resources for you to check out about your state draft plans. And then feel free to follow us on all of our other channels of social media. And with that, I say thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to having you join us again for another upcoming webinar. Thank you so much. Have a good day.